This is The Clockmaker's Silence, written by Coops. Some stories don't begin with love or loss, but with silence, the kind that lingers in the walls of an old shop, where every tick of a clock remembers someone who never came home. When Eleanor Hartley inherits her grandfather's clock shop in York, she steps into a world of oil, dust, and unanswered letters, and finds that time itself has been holding its breath. What she uncovers isn't just a mystery from the war, but a story of devotion that refused to die, a silence built not from cruelty, but from love too heavy to speak aloud. The Clockmaker's Silence, a story about time, loss, and the kind of love that keeps ticking long after the world has moved on. The Clockmaker's Silence, Chapter 1, The Inheritance. The sky over York had the color of old pewter, the kind that had belonged to someone's grandmother and outlived 3 dining tables. Rain threaded down the station glass in slow, patient lines. Eleanor Hartley stepped from the carriage with a suitcase in one hand and a solicitor's letter in the other. The paper softened at the fold where she'd opened and closed it too many times on the way north. Hartley Timepieces, Wren's Hollow, York. Premises and contents. Sole beneficiary, Miss Eleanor Margaret Hartley. No apology, no sentiment. A key taped to the bottom, as if the whole of a life, and all the rooms that held it, could be itemized and secured by a sliver of brass. She hadn't spoken to her grandfather in almost 10 years. They hadn't argued as such, not in any spectacular way. Their distance had grown the way lichen does, a quiet creep over surfaces, a softening of edges until the original shape was hard to make out. When her mother died, Thomas Hartley had withdrawn into a silence that felt, to a girl of 20, like refusal. Eleanor had done what she knew how to do then. She packed for London, took the acceptance letter to the conservation program like a rope across a fast river, and she didn't look back. Now she threaded through streets her feet still remembered, past the Minster's sudden geometry in the gray, past cafes that hadn't existed when she was a teenager and bookshops that had. Their names slipped from her mind and returned in a rush. York was stubborn about time. It changed its coat, never its bones. Cobbles underfoot, stone sweating rain, chimneys leaning like men at a bar. Wren's Hollow wasn't quite a street, more a narrowing of the air with a bakery at one end and a boarded tailor at the other. Hartley Timepieces crouched between them with the air of a creature that had survived a winter no one else noticed. The sign, Hartley Timepieces, Est, 1912, had lost its sheen and taken on the honest dullness of brass that remembered being bright. Moss traced a green handwriting along the woodwork. She stopped with the key in the lock, her palms suddenly damp. It was absurd to feel as if she were intruding. There was no one left to interrupt. Still, the hesitation found her and held her long enough for the rain to gather at the back of her collar. She turned the key. The door gave with a soft protest, and the scent that came up to meet her oil, varnish, old wood, a ghost of tea was so intact it felt like a hand on her shoulder. The shop had kept the light as best it could. Even on a day like this, the bay window drew a gray gentleness over everything. A careful veil. Clocks held the walls the way books hold a library. A long case with a sycamore moondial watched the door with a patient face. A brass carriage clock sat on a velvet pad like a small prince who had mislaid his court. A dozen cuckoos froze at the edge of whatever song they had intended and would not be coaxed. Silence has timbre. The silence in Hartley Timepieces wasn't empty, it was the held breath after the last chime, the hum inside a bell. Eleanor stepped slowly, the way she did in chapels and museums, and lifted the counterflap with care. Behind it, the workshop opened itself like the inside of a pocket watch. Benches, drawers, tools arranged with the kind of logic that made sense to the hands before it did to the tongue. His chair waited under a lamp with a flexible neck. His loupe lay on a chamois square. An enamel mug had stained a perfect circle on the bench. The tea long evaporated. The ring left like a moon on a map. She reached for the magnifier and caught herself before she put it to her eye. The gesture had muscle memory. She had watched him do it as a child and wanted, for a small, foolish second, to see what he saw when he peered into the honest machinery of a thing that kept time. Labels in his tidy slant told her what she already knew by heart from her own work. Escapements, barrels, springs, sorted, glasses, misc. A shallow drawer opened to rows of blued screws aligned like stitches. Another held gears in paper envelopes, each pencil marked with a diameter and a clock's initials. Her own handwriting, at 22, had aspired to this order and never quite got there. In the bottom bank, beneath the bench where his knees would have fitted, a drawer stuck on a splinter and then gave. Inside, bundles of envelopes lay tied with twine that had taken on the shape of the bindings. The paper showed its years in the soft fray at the edges. Her grandfather's hand on each address did not. To L. J. Wherever you are. L. J. The breath she took made a small sound in the quiet. She brought the top bundle to the bench and sat. The stool creaked as if greeting her by name. She untied the twine as if it might bruise and slid an envelope free. My dear Leo, the first line began. No date on the sheet, but the postmark on the outer told her it was 1940. The house is quiet without you. Your mother keeps your room as you left it. I fixed the toy train, the one with the chipped wheel. I'll keep it running until you come home. Love always, Dad. The letters of Dad were small, as if he had written them with his breath held. Eleanor read the page again without meaning to, and then reached for another. They came with the regularity of care. 1940, 1941, 1942, a gap where a stamp had torn away and been replaced. Rations and air raids, a new mainspring for Mrs. Davies' bracket clock. The minster at dusk. Quiet references to a Margaret, her grandmother, humming in the kitchen, and then a winter when the humming stopped. Her mother's name appeared once and only once, a note about a cough that had kept her in bed while the sirens sounded, and Eleanor wanted to fold the whole letter to her chest just to keep the warmth of the ink from fading. She knew evacuee stories, of course. Everyone did if they'd lived among northern brick long enough. Children taken to the countryside with gas masks and labels pinned to their coats. Promises of safety that sometimes kept and sometimes didn't. But the boy in these letters had a particularity the word evacuee never quite carried. Leo. L. J. He liked to draw pigeons. He had laughed when a cuckoo refused to return on time because the spring was dry. He had cried when a toy train derailed, and Thomas had said, gently, that everything worth loving derails now and then. Her hands shook by the third letter, not with sentiment, but with the sudden weight of a family she had thought she knew the outline of. Thomas Hartley had been a craftsman and a cold man. She had told herself a decent grandfather who had never learned how to speak the language of loss without writing it in silence. She had left because the house had swallowed sound. Here, on this bench, a different man sat down across from her in long ink lines, steady. A father who had tried to drag each day into dignity with a nib that never scratched hard enough to bruise. She stood to find air and walked the perimeter of the workshop. The small window at the back looked out onto a narrow yard where pots of thyme and mint had gone to seed. A single peg still held a cap with salt in its weave. On the wall at her shoulder hung a photograph she had not noticed on her first circuit. A boy of 7 with dark hair that didn't know how to lie flat. A toy train on a circle of track at his feet. The kind of careful solemnity in his eyes children have when they understand too much and intend to be good about it. There was no date on the mount, no caption, just the boy, the train, a hand at the edge of the frame that must have been Thomas's. In a shallow tray by the photo lay a half-built clock case in walnut, with its face turned to the wall. She lifted it and found, checkered on the reverse in small engraver's cuts, a line her chest knew before her eyes did. For LJ, when time brings you home. She had to sit again. The stool obliged with its old hinge creak. Work is a form of prayer when the heart has more feeling than language, and Eleanor had spent her adult life in that liturgy. She set the case carefully in the stand, drew the cloth over the bench, and began to inventory what lay before her in the way restorers do when they know they need to stand between a thing and harm. Notation calmed her sighs. Material, defect, remedy. She took out her notebook and wrote what she saw, because writing was a way to compel the room to be present tense. Under the bench, in a shallow wooden box, her fingers met a small weight and came away with a toy train, the paint worn on the corners to silver, the wheels polished to a brightness out of keeping with its age. She wound the key, half expecting tiredness and slack, and the motor took with a pleased little sound. The train moved around the circle once, twice, caught, and freed itself as if embarrassed. She laughed once, and the sound surprised her so much she stopped and listened for Thomas, as if he might answer from the room's edge with a comment about the regulator being just a touch stiff. Afternoon leaned into evening in a thinning of the light. The bay window filmed itself with condensation, the street beyond turning to impressions a bicycle, two shoulders under a shared umbrella. She relit the gas heater and made tea in the small back room where an enamel sink awaited in the bent pose of old fixtures. The mug she chose bore a stain inside the lip where tea had cooled often. She didn't wash it out. The flat above the shop, when she climbed the narrow stair, looked like someone had stepped out midway through believing they were coming back. A single armchair by the window, a bookcase that bowed under manuals, a bed made to the military neatness of men who like corners to agree with each other. On the mantel, a tiny photograph she had missed on the way down, a young woman in a floral dress, standing in a garden with her hair pinned back and her eyes doing the work a smile sometimes cannot. Her mother had kept one like it in a drawer. Margaret, not her mother, her grandmother. Names in this family had pinwheeled. Grief and tradition had braided in ways that left some labels tangled. The woman's mouth had a line at one corner Eleanor recognized from mirrors. She took the letters up with her and read on the floor by the heater until the words blurred. 1943 brought a winter. No hot water bottle could pacify, and then a spring that did not. A death. The handwriting stayed neat. The sentences shortened. In 1944, an entry noted a boy seen near the minster chasing pigeons and the way the light had caught his hair and made Thomas's breath go wrong. It wasn't you, he wrote, as if apology could be sent to a future that might or might not open the envelope. In 1945, he wrote without dates, no longer pretending the post carried anything he needed it to. The last in the bundle had no make of time on it at all. My dear Leo, I am building something for you. It will wait, even if I cannot. Underneath, a sketch in pencil of a clock face with Roman numerals, the 12, a fraction bolder, the way craftsmen sometimes do when they want a dial to have character. She ran her thumb lightly across the graphite and knew from the pressure where he had hesitated and pressed on, the way hands do when the heart makes them. It would have been easier, perhaps, to be angry that he had not told her, that he had kept a son folded into drawers she didn't know to open, that he had built his house on the stout timbers of silence and expected the next generation to live there without asking about the draft under the door. But the room made that sort of thinking feel childish. The letters sat in their honest sheaves. The tools kept their places. The train did its wobbly circuit with faith. Grief had its architecture. It was not pretty, but it was built to last. By the time the rain eased to a damp that felt woven into the stone, Eleanor knew the facts she could gather from this room would not be enough. Facts do not warm the hands. Stories do. She put the letters back into their drawer with care that felt like apology and promise together, locked the front door, and stood for a minute on the step. The alley had taken on that night smell cities have when the day lets them be themselves. The minster's bells layered the dark with familiar distance. Back upstairs, she unrolled her London habits and folded them to fit this room. She fetched sheets from the cupboard that smelled faintly of lavender, made the bed like someone laid up in solitude for a long time should have taught her flat sheet. Hospital corners, top sheet turned back. She put her case under the bed because it felt absurd to live out of it. She stood a long while at the window with the light off, the city soft and breathing, and told herself the things she always told herself when a restoration began, and the object on her bench looked like more history than hand could hold. You don't need to do it all tonight. You need only begin and keep faith with the next careful act. On the small table by the bed, she set her phone face down, then turned it over and typed Ashcombe into the maps she rarely trusted. A cluster of lanes north and a scatter of fields. No station. The kind of place that expected you to mean it if you wanted to arrive. She bookmarked 2 names she didn't recognize and the number of a parish office. She closed her eyes. In the edge space before sleep, the mind loosens its grip and lets strange company in. The boy from the photograph appeared at the end of the bench, his hair impossible, his hands careful on the toy train. In the other chair, Thomas leaned in his old way, brow furrowed not with disapproval but with concentration. The clock between them hadn't yet found its tick. Eleanor, in that moment where dream holds the light just so, watched the 3 of them do the work of beginning. She did not cry. Not then. Tears have their own schedules. When she woke before dawn to the sound of rain stitching at the window, the sentence lay on the inside of her mouth ready to be said aloud to the empty room, and she did say it because speaking is a way to turn promises into tools. I'm going to find him, she said. I'm going to find where he went, and I'm going to finish the clock. The city held its breath and then let it go. Somewhere, downstairs, a small gear settled as the air warmed. The shop was not silent anymore. It was waiting. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Wasn't There. The sirens had learned the streets by heart, and the streets had learned the siren's voice in return. They slid under doors and across tabletops. They found the hollows of teacups and the curve of a sleeping child's ear. In the weeks after the first raids, York lived between pitches of sound, the rising that turned throats dry, the falling that sent breath back into bodies with a shiver of shame for having held it so long. Thomas stood in the doorway of the shop, one hand on the frame as if the wood could steady something inside his chest. Through the front window, he watched his son wind a toy train around a loop of track on the counter. L.J., Leo to his mother, had the look of a small engineer tongue between teeth, brow furrowed in the way of boys who copy their fathers without meaning to. The wheel he'd chipped on Tuesday now ran true. Thomas had burnished the axle with a sliver of emery and felt, for 5 careful minutes, that he had made of the world a place where small things could be mended. Margaret came from the back room with a suitcase that looked thinner than the word suitcase allowed. Patches on the corners. A leather handle darkened by years of hands. She had packed the way the war notices told mothers to pack book, socks, jumper, toothbrush, the small tin of caramels she pretended not to keep for bad days. The tag she had written in tidy capitals swung from the strap and made her eyes shine with an anger too delicate to be called anger at all. "He's ready," she said. Her voice had learned quiet since September. Don't because the world asked kindness of it, but because the world punished loudness with echo. Thomas nodded. Nodding had become his language, the way he kept the lid on the moving parts. He wanted to say, "We could keep him here. We could take turns in the cellar. We could build him a nest under the bench with the mainsprings and the cigar boxes of screws," he wanted to say. "Perhaps the knocking will be elsewhere. Perhaps the planes will go wrong and never find us," he wanted to say. "I cannot lift him onto that train any more than I can lift the minster." But the notices were not suggestions, and when he had taken the train to Leeds last month to fit a new suspension spring to a regulator clock, He had seen with his own eyes a street in daylight holding the shadows of roofs that no longer existed. A child's marbles glinting in rubble, the taste of dust in his mouth that had not been born of his workshop. At the station, everything happened at once and also very slowly. The platform was a spill of mothers and tags and wool coats, gas masks like black tin beetles under small arms. The white chalk numbers on the carriage sides looked like sums that came out wrong regardless of how you rearranged them. Volunteers moved in that brisk kindness some people can, and everyone begins to slide. Leo's hand in his felt like a key in a lock that had not yet decided which way it wanted to turn. "Will you write?" the boy asked, as if letters were barricades he could stack between himself and whatever lay beyond the hedgerows. "Every week," Thomas said. He used the voice he saved for mainsprings under tension, steady as a pulse. "I'll post on Thursdays. You can count them on your fingers and know when the next one is due." "And you'll fix the train if it breaks," Leo said, the way boys do when they negotiate for a world that holds. "I'll fix the train if it even thinks about breaking," Thomas said. He tried to smile and discovered his mouth had become a cautious instrument. Margaret crouched to button Leo's coat. Her hands shook once and then remembered how to behave. She kissed his forehead and left her lips there a second too long, as if warmth could be forced into a future. "You mind your manners," she said, which is what mothers say when all the other sentences in the world have become too large to pick up. The whistle blew. Steam shouldered into the air. Thomas lifted his son onto the carriage step and passed the suitcase up, as if handing a heart to a stranger and asking them not to drop it. Leo turned and waved. The small, brave shape of him in the carriage window knocked something loose at the back of Thomas's throat. He held his hand up until the train had made waving unnecessary, until it rounded the mild curve and took the day with it. That night, the house made a different sound. Houses do when a presence is removed, and the doors breathe more deeply. The floorboards speak in a dialect you don't recognize. Margaret sat in Leo's room and folded his blanket down over the pillow, and then folded it again for no reason at all. Thomas went to the bench and put his hands palm down to the scarred surface to see if the wood would offer him instruction. When it didn't, he reached for paper. "My dear Leo," he wrote, "the house is quiet without you. Your mother keeps your room as you left it. I fixed the toy train again. The wheel was only pretending. I'll keep it running until you come home. Love always." He folded the sheet upright and clean, addressed the envelope to the farm the board had given him, sealed it with a dampened brush, and the certainty of men who work with friction and fit the blessed click when two pieces know they belong. He wrote on Thursdays. Sometimes he cheated and wrote on Saturday as well, because some weeks held more silence than others, and the extra words filled a cup. He told his boy about clocks because clocks were what he knew how to explain. The French carriage, with the cracked platform he had, rebuilt in brass, the long case with the painted moon that turned too eager and had to be taught patience. Mrs. Davies' bracket clock, that ran fast when the rain came because the case swelled like a singer's chest, and the pendulum kissed the backboard. He wrote about the pigeons nesting under the eaves and how they insisted on being fools. He wrote about Margaret's humming coming back in tiny pieces as if she were tuning herself. He wrote about air, raid wardens and tea that tasted of tin. He wrote about the way the minster remained, colossal and absurd, as if to say, "This is what we mean by enduring." The first letter back arrived on a Wednesday and nearly broke him. The hand was not Leo's too upright, too wife of Farmer Tidy, but the voice gathered between the lines where the ink faltered and made space. "Dear Mr. Hartley, Leo is well, eats little, works well. He likes to draw the church. He will write next week when chores allow. No best wishes, no regards. A note without cushioning, still." The envelope had come from Ashcombe, and that was enough. He held it too long and then put it in a drawer he could reach without looking. 2 notes followed in 2 months. A third, this time in a child's hand. A short, stubborn line, "I like the cows, but they kick the bucket if you make them cross." "I made a clock in mud and it fell over. I think the church clock is wrong." He read the line about wrongness 3 times and smiled, because the boy had his eye. He wrote back about escapements, as if the word were a toy he could post, something with weight and shine. After 3 months, the replies ceased. Thursday letters still left Hartley timepieces in their careful suits of envelope and stamp. None returned, none arrived. The board, when he went with his hat in his hands and his manner suited to men who wanted officials to be human, offered a ledger and an apology polished by use. The boy arrived, the farm was sold, the family moved on, no forwarding address, war. "Mr. Hartley, these things happen in war." The clerk's ink-stained fingers betrayed him when he pushed the ledger aside too quickly. He was a boy in a man's chair, and he had no more geography than Thomas did for this sort of displacement. Thomas came home and checked the shop for dust the way some men check their roofs for bombs. He cleaned and sorted and wrote. He began a clock he would not finish. Walnut case, Roman dial, the 12 a hair deeper cut. On the back, with the small graver he used for signatures, he cut a line of text for LJ, "When time brings you home." He did not show Margaret. He did not need to. She lived now in a corridor where the doors all led back to the day at the station. Autumn went thin. Winter took the color out of the air. On certain nights he sat with his coat on and his cap in his lap because the sirens liked to come when you weren't ready. He tried to teach himself not to flinch at the falling tone and failed. He learned the short, stiff sleep of men who do not trust the dark to hold. When spring came, it came like a rumor. A green smear along the hedges. Pigeons behaving like idiots on a little more sun. Margaret had a fever in April that the doctor called pneumonia, and Thomas called after. She was small in the bed. And then smaller. She pressed his sleeve between her fingers as if checking the cloth for flaws. "He'll come back," she said once, very clear, and then she slept and did not say anything again that wasn't breathing. After the funeral, he closed the shop for a month and took it personally when the long case in the window refused to keep time. He took apart a French movement he had repaired twice and found nothing wrong with it. He put it back, together anyway. He placed a chair in the corner of Leo's room and sat in it and tried to make a promise to no one that he would not let the house become a shrine, and failed at that too. Men who work with tiny tolerances are not kind to themselves when they cannot make the world obey. He wrote through that year as if letters were scaffolding. Not to the farm now, not to any address, just to L.J. on the front and the rest left be. Blank. He tied them with twine each month and labeled the bundle with a pencil like he labeled cases July, August. He put them in the bottom drawer where the bench would hide them from casual light. He wrote the ordinary, the repair of a balance staff, the quiet of Sundays when the clocks all agreed for an hour, the hum of the gas ring. He allowed himself 1 sentence each week that bent toward belief. "I saw a boy today near the Minster, chasing pigeons. For a second I thought my chest would break. It wasn't you, but it looked like how you would have run here." He left the ink to dry on that and did not blot it because he wanted the shimmer to take a little longer to settle. He tried the board again, and the policeman who had learned how to say war like a handkerchief you bring out for messes. He walked as far as Ashcombe once on a day off, because the trains were idling and the buses only took you halfway across any story. The lanes were hedged with nettles, and the church leaned with its bell, determined. The farm that had taken his boy stood with its gate wired shut and its yard rutted. He knocked on a door that belonged to no one, and heard his hand come back to him. In the village hall, an old woman with a needle stuck in her cardigan said she remembered a boy who drew the clock tower with a serious mouth and ran away the night a sow broke its farrowing crate. "They weren't kind, them Whittakers," she said, and then looked at his hat, as if it could tell her why he hadn't arrived sooner. He thanked her and stood in the lane until his legs remembered they were his. He came home and built the chime for the half-made clock and left it on the bench without its voice. He wrote, "My dear Leo," and put the nib down and took it up again. He brewed tea at odd hours and left mugs in places that would surprise him later, as if finding them could be small victories. He repaired a watch for a soldier on leave, who told him he valued the tick near his skin when the sky growled. He said little and handed the watch back, and the soldier said his mother would be glad, and Thomas left the workroom and steadied himself against the cool of the wall in the back passage and remembered Margaret humming a wartime song into a tea towel. He was not a man who cried where people could see. He was a man who kept the mechanisms oiled and his sentences short, but grief has a way of finding the unguarded door. In 1945, the city sang and the bells lifted their throats and held the note as long as metal can. He stood among neighbors with streamers in their hair and women with lipstick they had kept for the right day. He held a paper cup of beer he did not drink, and he smiled, and he was glad. He was glad with the part of himself that remembered being a boy. He came home early and sat at the bench and wrote a letter with 4 lines and folded it and did not tie it to the bundle because it needed to be alone. "My dear Leo, the war is over. I am finishing the clock. I will not close the door. Love, Dad." The years that came after did not decide to be kinder because of the end of a war. They decided to be years, which is another way of saying they brought bread and rain in the usual Roddy. Customers learned to speak to him in the language of work because he had made it clear work was the only dialect he wished to share. He kept boys' bicycles true more often than he charged for. Widows' door latches, and pretended the screwdriver in his pocket had been in his hand because he had meant to call. He answered questions with answers that worked in a workshop and would not be shamed by the questions that did. He wrote on Thursdays. "Time does not heal," he discovered. "It accumulates. It layers. It softens some edges so you can pick things up without bleeding. And it sharpens others so you remember where not to place your fingers." He grew the kind of quiet that is not empty, but densely packed with unsaids. People called it stoicism. He called it keeping the train on the track even. When the table shook, when the photograph was taken, the one Eleanor would find decades later beside the toy train, it was a Thursday. He remembered because he had left the envelope open to dry and he had turned to see Leo at the counter in a way that made his hands forget their ache. It was not Leo. It was a neighbor's boy who had wandered in to sell him a box of buttons his mother no longer needed. But the boy's hair refused to lie down, and his mouth made the same. Shape around concentration, and Thomas had picked up the camera without thinking and pressed the shutter before the reason to do so had time to be embarrassed. He developed the print at the chemist's and brought it back and set it by the train because the room needed the shape of a boy in it. Years later, when his hands had the thinness of age, and his eyes preferred to be assisted by glass, he began putting the letters in order. He sorted them the way he sorted wheels, by size, by function, by the degree of pressure they would bear. He labeled bundles and put them in the bottom drawer, not as a way to hide, but as a way to say, "Here," if anyone had the sense to look. He took the half-built clock in walnut down once, and touched the case with oil, and he engraved a second line beneath the first and immediately regretted it and then forgave himself. When his granddaughter left for London, he understood the geography of it. He had taught her to use a loop when she was 10, and she had lifted her head grinning like a girl who had just learned a magic trick. He had not known. Then how to make sentences that included both stay and go, he had said. Be well and work hard, and a dozen other phrases that sounded like a man waving from a platform. The silence widened into a habit between them and habits. Like clocks, do the thing they are built to do until someone takes them apart and cleans them. He did not take their distance apart. He wrote to her birthdays and not often enough. He put money aside in a biscuit tin tucked in the false back of a drawer. He wrote on Thursdays. He tied the letters, and when his breath moved with the caution of a man carrying a cup filled to the brim, he put a key in an envelope and sent it to a solicitor, because he could not write her what he needed to. He could only set the room for her. He could only arrange the drawers. He could only ask the wood and the paper and the brass to tell her the rest. In the shop, on a certain gray afternoon decades after the war, a half-made clock kept its walnut patience on a stand. A toy train with polished wheels waited for fingertips. A photograph balanced a room. His new wife, the mother of his daughter, Margaret. A woman with hands made for gentleness measured in millimeters, restored gold leaf to frames she would never see again. Time went about its ordinary holy business. Somewhere between the two, a line of ink dried on a page that had waited too long to be turned. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Dust. The morning after Eleanor found the letters, York woke under a sky the color of pewter again, a sky that couldn't decide whether to weep or wait. Rain tapped lightly against the window of the flat above the shop, the sound finding its way into her half-dreams. She woke slowly, tangled in sheets that smelled faintly of machine oil and lavender, the scent of the life her grandfather had lived long after he stopped sharing it. The shop below felt different now. It wasn't a room anymore, it was a pulse. The letters had made it alive again, and their presence pressed gently against the floorboards beneath her feet. She sat at the small kitchen table with a mug of tea that had gone cold twice before she remembered to drink it. Every swallow brought that steady rhythm of clockwork to her mind, the measured patience of a man who had spent his whole life fixing time while quietly breaking inside it. On the mantelpiece above the gas heater was a photograph she hadn't noticed before. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8, standing proudly beside a toy train, his hair an untidy dark halo. There was something solemn in his expression, the seriousness of children who know they're being trusted with something precious. The train in his hand matched the one she'd wound the night before. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. No name, no date, just a ghost caught in silver paper. Downstairs, the smell of brass, dust, and varnish met her like a welcome. She found herself at the workbench without remembering the walk down the stairs. The letters waited where she'd left them. A silent company, bound and aged but still breathing. She untied one bundle, reading slowly, letting the words anchor her in her grandfather's world. The letters from 1942 had grown shorter, as if each word cost something. The neat handwriting trembled occasionally, betraying moments when the hand behind it had been less sure. My dear Leo, I've taken apart the long case from Street John's again. It keeps better time when I think of you. Your mother says I'm wasting oil, but I tell her it's patience I'm burning through. By the third letter in the bundle, Margaret's name was missing. Then came the first letter that mentioned her death not as an event, but as a weather report, written as if Thomas couldn't yet believe it had happened. The house is quiet now, Leo. Too quiet. I keep your room open. I still wind the clock in the hall every night, so the house doesn't forget your heartbeat. Eleanor pressed her fingers against the page. The paper crackled under her skin, brittle but unbroken. She read until the afternoon light began to fade, until the clocks surrounding her turned from shapes to shadows. Then she picked up the photograph again, the toy train visible in miniature near the boy's feet. It was too deliberate, too lovingly placed the photograph had been staged. Thomas had wanted to keep a record of something that was already slipping from his reach. She turned the frame over and found, tucked into the back, a tiny folded paper, yellowed and fragile. She unfolded it with care. Inside, in that same steady handwriting, were 6 words, "For when she is ready to know." Her heart clenched. For her, it had to be. He had known she would come here one day, that she would find this, that she would go looking. That night, she didn't sleep much. The rain came again, heavier now, drumming against the windows like fingers on glass. She made another mug of tea, drank half of it standing by the sink, then sat back down at the workbench. The drawer she hadn't yet opened, the one marked private, waited quietly beneath her hand. She slid it open. Inside lay an old tin box with a broken clasp. Inside that, neatly stacked papers, receipts, wartime ration slips, newspaper clippings. At the very bottom, a thin brown envelope with a red wax seal that had cracked with age. She pried it open. Evacuation Board Record, York District, September 1940. Her pulse stumbled. Inside, a single sheet. Name: Hartley, Leo James. Age: 7. Destination: Ashcombe, North Yorkshire. Host family: Whittaker, Samuel and Clara. Arrival: confirmed. Departure: not recorded. Not recorded. The words landed like a door closing in her chest. She stared at them until the letters blurred. The air in the shop seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just grief, now it was something else. Injustice. The idea that her grandfather had lived 60 more years with that single unanswered line hanging above his life like a stopped pendulum. By morning, she had made up her mind. The archives on Clifford Street opened at 9. The young man behind the counter looked mildly apologetic before she'd even finished her request. "Evacuation records can be incomplete, miss," he said. "We lost a lot during the war, but I can check the microfiche." He returned half an hour later with a folder so thin it felt like an insult. Inside, a typed page identical to the one in Thomas's tin box. One more line at the bottom. Placement review requested. January 1, 1941. Eleanor looked up. "Review requested by whom?" The clerk shook his head. "Doesn't say. Likely the school board or the host family. But the file ends there." She folded the page carefully, as if it were a living thing, and left the building. Outside, York's air was damp with late afternoon drizzle. She walked without direction for a while, letting the cobblestones choose for her. Her mind wouldn't quiet. The thought of that boy, her great-uncle, a child lost in bureaucracy, gnawed at her. Not recorded felt like the cruelest phrase in the English language. By the time she reached Wren's Hollow again, dusk had swallowed the street. She unlocked the shop and stepped inside, the air closing around her like an embrace. The clocks were darker shapes now, their brass hearts gleaming faintly in the lamplight. She crossed to the back bench. The toy train still sat where she'd left it. She wound it, once, gently, and watched it circle the loop of track her grandfather had built. The wheels clinked softly, steady and certain. The sound filled the room like a heartbeat. In the box beside it lay the unfinished clock case walnut, worn smooth by years of waiting. She turned it over, her fingertips tracing the engraving she'd found the day before. "For LJ, when time brings you home," she whispered the words out loud. "Time brings you home," and felt the truth of them bloom in her chest like something fragile and dangerous. That night, she searched for Ashcombe online. Population 247, no train station, one pub, a church, a scatter of farmhouses. No mention of the Whittakers, no wartime records, no answers. She opened her grandfather's last letter to Leo and read it again. "I'm building something for you. It will wait, even if I cannot." Eleanor touched the unfinished clock, her fingers trembling. "You waited," she whispered. "Now it's my turn." The rain eased outside, leaving the air thick and still. Inside Hartley timepieces, the silence settled again, but not the kind that meant absence. This silence breathed. It ticked. It listened. Eleanor sat down at the bench, drew her notebook close, and wrote a single line across the first page. "Tomorrow, I go to Ashcombe." The toy train clicked once on its track, almost as if in agreement, and the clock above the door began to tick again after years of stillness, slow, uncertain, but alive. Chapter 4. The Village of Ashcombe. The road to Ashcombe unraveled through the hills like a memory familiar in shape but distant in feeling. Eleanor drove slowly, wipers squeaking across a windshield freckled with rain. The city had long fallen away behind her, replaced by hedgerows slick with moss and fields the color of damp wool. The letters sat on the passenger seat beside her, bound with their old twine, her grandfather's neat handwriting watching her like an accusation and a promise all at once. York had been a city of echoes, cobblestones holding footsteps, buildings leaning toward one another as if still whispering secrets from the war. But Ashcombe was a hush. Even the wind seemed careful here. A place untouched by ambition, unhurried by time, the kind of place that didn't need to remember because nothing had ever been allowed to change. She found the village just as the rain broke into mist. A single main street curled between rows of gray stone cottages, their roofs laced with ivy and their windows glimmering faintly with the light of wood stoves. A pub with a swinging sign, the King's Arms, and further down, a church with a crooked steeple that leaned like an old man toward the earth. A shop that looked half general store, half memory. Eleanor parked beside the churchyard gate. The air smelled of peat and wet leaves, and beneath it all, something metallic, the old scent of rain on iron. Her boots sank softly into the grass as she walked between gravestones tilting like teeth. Names blurred by lichen. Some stones had no names left at all, just shapes where letters used to be. She thought of the evacuation lists, of all those entries stamped, not recorded, and the thought sat heavy in her stomach. Inside the church, the air was cold and close. Dust motes floated in the gray light that spilled through stained glass. She paused beside a memorial plaque near the door. To the children of Ashcombe sent away, and those who did not return. The brass had dulled with time, but someone had placed a small posy beneath it wilted daisies tied with string. She felt her throat tighten. At the far end of the nave, a woman was arranging flowers into vases, her movements slow but sure. She was small and stooped, her hair a soft halo of white pinned with care. When she looked up, her eyes were startlingly clear, sharp blue, steady, alive. "Morning," the woman said, her Yorkshire vowels broad and rooted. "You'll be a stranger here." "I am," Eleanor admitted, stepping closer. "I'm looking for information about a family, the Whittakers. They lived here during the war. They took in an evacuee boy, Leo Hartley." The woman's hands froze around the stems of chrysanthemums. For a moment she didn't speak. Then, softly, "I remember him." Eleanor's breath caught. "You do?" The woman nodded. "I was 12 then. Lived down by the mill with my mum and granddad. We used to see him at the church sometimes, sitting by the wall, sketching the clock tower. Quiet lad. Polite. Always said please and thank you like he meant it." "Do you remember what happened to him?" Eleanor asked. The woman set down her scissors. "Aye, I do, though folk stopped talking about it. Said it weren't proper to dwell on sad things when the war was on." She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Name's Iris Cooper. I've lived here all me life. The Whittakers were rough sorts, not cruel, mind, just hard. Lost 2 sons in France, never quite came back themselves. When they got the evacuee, they didn't treat him like a guest, more like another pair o' hands for the farm. Made him work before school, after supper too. You could see the tired on him." Eleanor felt her hands tremble. Did anyone do anything?" Iris gave her a sad smile. "Those were different days, love. Teachers saw bruises and called it discipline. A boy running away weren't news back then, it were a nuisance. But Leo, he had summat else in him. Kindness, maybe, or courage. One night, after a storm, he just vanished. Took his sketchbook, left everything else behind. The police looked for a week, but there's woods thick as stories round here. And once you're in 'em, you might as well be smoke." The church bells tolled softly, marking the hour. The sound seemed to hang between them like breath. "Did anyone ever find him?" Eleanor whispered. "No body, no trace," Iris said. But she hesitated, her fingers twisting the apron hem. "A few weeks after, I found a bit of paper near the church wall, folded up tight. Thought it were nothin' till I opened it. It were one of his drawings. The clock tower, same as he always sketched, but with words written underneath. I kept it." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Do you still have it?" Iris nodded slowly and crossed to a wooden cabinet near the vestry. She opened a drawer, rummaged through a tin box, and pulled out a folded sheet, yellowed and thin but intact. "I never knew what to do with it," she said, offering it with both hands. "Didn't seem right to throw it away." Eleanor unfolded it carefully. A pencil sketched the church's crooked steeple, rendered with a child's precision. Beneath it, in uneven lettering, "Time waits for no one." In the corner, initials L.J. Her throat closed. She ran her fingers lightly across the faded lines. It was him, her great-uncle, a boy trying to make sense of the world through the language of drawing. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. I can't tell you how much this means." Iris smiled faintly. He was a good lad. Deserved better. Some said he ran off toward the moors. Some said the Romani camp took him in. Nobody ever proved either way. But I like to think he found his way somewhere kind. Outside, the mist had thickened, turning the village into a watercolor soft edges, no hard lines. Eleanor stood by her car, the drawing clutched to her chest. The church clock chimed again, 1, 2, 3, and she realized it was the same tower her great-uncle had drawn, still standing, still marking the same rhythm more than 80 years later. She unfolded one of Thomas's letters from her bag and read it quietly in the drizzle. "My dear Leo, I built a clock today. It chimes every hour, but I still listen for your voice. I hope you're warm. I hope you're loved. Love always. Dad." Her tears blurred the ink, and the mist gathered around her like breath. In the distance, a field stretched toward the dark line of woods. She could almost see him, a boy, in an oversized coat, running, the sketchbook clutched in his arms, the world too big and too loud behind him. Eleanor folded the letter and the drawing together, tucking them carefully into her coat pocket. The past wasn't finished yet. It was still speaking, one tick at a time. She started the engine, the wipers sweeping arcs through the fog. There were more answers waiting. She could feel it. The silence that had swallowed her family for generations was beginning to break, and she wasn't going to stop until it had spoken its last word. Chapter 5. The Silence Breaks. The road back from Ashcombe shimmered beneath a watery sun. The mist had lifted, leaving behind a clarity that almost hurt the eyes, pale skies, hedgerows dripping with last night's rain. The moors rolled out like a sigh that never quite ended. Eleanor drove without music, the drawing resting on the passenger seat beside her, the faint words, "Time waits for no one," etched behind her eyes. It was strange, she thought, how grief could belong to someone you had never met. Leo L.J. had become more than a name. He was a shadow threading through her bloodline, shaping her family's silence, turning her grandfather into a ghost long before his death. She stopped at a lay-by overlooking the valley and sat for a moment, letting the car tick as it cooled. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar older, softer somehow. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the drawing. The pencil lines were faint but determined, the strokes careful and patient, like her grandfather's handwriting. 2 generations connected by graphite and longing. By the time she reached York, dusk was falling again. The city was slick with evening rain, pavements glimmering like wet slate. She parked outside the shop and sat for a long time, watching the reflection of the sign Hartley timepieces shiver in a puddle. The same letters her grandfather must have painted himself. Steady hand, gold leaf catching the light. Inside, the shop felt warmer than usual. The air held the scent of oil and walnut polish. She lit the lamp on the counter, its yellow glow pushing the shadows into corners. The clocks, dozens of them, all ticked at their own rhythms, some slow, some impatient, none in unison. The sound filled the air like quiet conversation. She spread the drawing and the letters across the workbench, arranging them in order: her grandfather's words, Leo's art, her own notes. A lifetime of searching, now joined by one more pair of hands. The next morning, she began digging. York's city archives had already given her the outline. Now she wanted the threads that ran between the lines. She spent hours bent over microfilm readers, scrolling through wartime newspapers, looking for any mention of Ashcombe or the Whitakers. Bombing raids, ration updates, church notices the past laid out in typewriter ink. Then, in a corner of an August 1942 issue, she found a fragment. Local family leaves Ashcombe farm property sold to settlers from Leeds. No mention of where they went. No forwarding address. Just another vanishing. She pushed on. In a dusty box of church ledgers, she found one more clue: a faded entry written in a vicar's tidy hand. Donation received 10 shillings from traveling Petrovic family in gratitude for the boys' safe arrival. A single line, nearly lost to mildew, but it burned through her exhaustion. In gratitude for the boys' safe arrival. Leo had survived. She whispered it aloud, testing the shape of the words. He survived. The idea made her dizzy. That evening, she sat at the workbench again, the letters around her like witnesses. The lamp hummed quietly. Rain streaked the window. She stared at the vicar's note until her vision blurred, then opened her laptop and began searching. Petrovic family. Traveling, Yorkshire, 1940s. It took hours, dead ends, half references, interviews archived in oral history projects. But one name appeared again and again. A Romani family known for woodworking and music, who had traveled fairs and markets across the north for generations. She found a Romani heritage center listed in Leeds. The next day, she drove there. The building was small and bright, tucked between two warehouses on the outskirts of the city. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old paper. Hand-carved violins hung from the walls, alongside photographs of families gathered around caravans, their smiles wide and genuine. The woman at the front desk wore silver bangles that chimed when she moved. She listened to Eleanor's story without interruption. The letters, the evacuation, the missing boy. When Eleanor said the name Hartley, the woman's expression softened. Jonas, she said quietly. We knew him as Jonas Hartley. He came to us as a boy, frightened, polite, good with his hands, said his parents had died, but he never said where he'd come from. Eleanor's throat tightened. You knew him? I didn't, love, but my aunt did. She reached for a binder and flipped through its yellowed pages, stopping at a photograph. A man in his 60s, tanned, smiling shyly beside a small wooden clock. Jonas Hartley. Traveled with the Petrovics till the end. Made toys for the children. Carved birds that could balance on your finger. Eleanor traced the image with her fingertip. He's my great-uncle, she whispered. He ran away from Ashcombe in 1941. We thought he'd died. The woman smiled gently. No, he lived. Died in 96. Buried near Wakefield. No family listed, but he was loved. Everyone called him the quiet one who made time sing. The words hit her like a tide. He lived. Her voice trembled. Is there anyone I could talk to? Someone who knew him? The woman nodded. Wait a moment. She picked up the phone and dialed. After a few minutes, she said, Luka Petrovic, Jonas's nephew. He remembers him well. An hour later, Eleanor found herself sitting in a small terraced house, smelling faintly of varnish and pine shavings. Luka was in his 40s, kind-eyed, his hands broad and rough from carpentry. He listened as she explained everything, the letters, the search, the silence that had followed her family for decades. When she finished, he nodded slowly. He was gentle, Luca said, never raised his voice, made music boxes for every child in our family, said each tick was a heartbeat borrowed from someone he loved. Eleanor's eyes stung. He never tried to find us? Luca looked down. He said his family had forgotten him, that going back would hurt them. I think he wanted to protect you from his shame. She opened her satchel and pulled out a handful of the letters, the ones written in the war's darkest years, filled with her grandfather's unwavering hope. He wasn't forgotten, she said softly. He never was. Luca read one of the letters, the one about the pigeons on the minster roof. He smiled, then wiped his eyes. He would have liked this, he said. He kept a little box of old sketches and notes. He said they were for the son of the clockmaker. Do you still have them? She asked. He nodded and disappeared into the next room. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. The lid was carved with a feather and the initials L.J. Inside were delicate wooden carvings, a bird in flight, a violin bridge, a clock hand. Beneath them, a faded photograph. Jonas as an old man, smiling at the camera, a carved clock behind him. Eleanor held the photograph carefully. For the first time, she could see his eyes dark, kind, familiar. Her grandfather's eyes, her own eyes. Luca rested a hand on her shoulder. He used to hum while he worked, he said. Said the rhythm kept the world from falling apart. I think your grandfather would understand that. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. When she finally left, the sky had deepened into a bruise-blue dusk. The streets glistened after rain, and the car smelled faintly of pine from the carvings she'd been given. She drove in silence, the weight in her chest equal parts sorrow and gratitude. Her great-uncle hadn't died in the woods. He had lived a full life, quiet, creative, kind. He had become what his father had been, a maker of time. Back in York, she placed the photograph beside the toy train on the workbench. Next to it, she set one of Jonas's carvings, a tiny wooden feather balanced perfectly on its tip. Then she opened the final letter in her grandfather's bundle. My dear Leo, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I believe you're out there. I believe you remember. I built a clock for you. It waits, even if I cannot. Love, always, Dad. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it beside the others. The workshop was silent, except for the faint ticking of the oldest clocks, a soft, uneven choir of memory. For the first time, she understood what her grandfather had been building all along. Not just clocks, but bridges, fragile ones made of hope, between the living and the lost. She wound the clock on the bench. It began to tick, slow, sure, alive. The silence, at last, had broken. Chapter 6. The Clock That Waited. The morning broke clean and bright, the kind of winter light that made everything look sharper than it really was. Edges of rooftops, crisp, windows glinting, the air almost too pure to breathe. Inside Hartley timepieces, the light spilled across rows of clocks like spilled gold. Eleanor stood at the workbench, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the scent of brass polish and linseed oil thick in the air. Before her lay the unfinished clock, her grandfather's masterpiece. It had waited decades for this. The walnut casing was smooth under her fingers, rich and warm as living skin. Each gear gleamed where she'd cleaned it, and the face delicately etched with Roman numerals and a faint pattern of leaves caught the light as if it remembered sunlight from long ago. The engraving on the back still made her chest tighten. For L.J., when time brings you home. She traced the letters slowly, then took up the small engraving tool and added her own beneath it, the words barely visible but true. Found, remembered, loved. Every tick of the surrounding clocks echoed like applause. For days she worked at it, rising with the dawn and working until the last of the light faded behind the minster. The rhythm steadied her, soothed her. She measured cogs, filed down pivots, cleaned dust from crevices where time itself seemed to have gathered. She lost track of the hours. Meals went cold, nights blurred into mornings. It was as if her grandfather's hands guided hers, showing her how to listen to the heartbeat of a machine that had been silent too long. When she finally fitted the last gear and polished the glass face, she sat back and stared at it, the clock that had carried 2 generations of love, loss, and waiting. She hadn't just restored it, she'd given it a soul. Now it was ready to speak. She wound it carefully, her pulse matching the turn of the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint, hesitant tick broke the silence, a single note, followed by another, until the sound filled the room. Soft, patient, alive. It was like hearing someone breathe after too long a silence. Eleanor closed her eyes. The sound surrounded her, steady as a heartbeat, warm as the voice of someone remembered. Later that week, she decided the clock's first chime shouldn't be hers alone. She wrote to Iris in Ashcombe, inviting her to York. She called Luka Petrovic, explaining what she'd done and asking if he and his family might come. They all agreed without hesitation. On a pale Saturday morning, as frost turned the shop front to glass, they gathered inside Hartley timepieces. Iris came first, leaning on her cane but walking with purpose. "I never thought I'd step foot in a clock shop again," she said, smiling faintly. "Seems only fair I came to see this through." Luka followed, his wife and young daughter with him. The little girl pressed her nose to the display case, mesmerized by the rows of tiny, ticking worlds. Eleanor guided them into the workshop. "It's here," she said quietly. The clock stood on the center bench, polished to a gentle sheen, the walnut dark and gleaming, the brass face glinting softly in the lamplight. The words on the back 4LJ, "When time brings you home," seemed to glow faintly. Iris's eyes welled up. "He'd be proud," she whispered. "Both of them would." Luka nodded, his voice thick. He used to say clocks were just hearts with hands. Maybe he wasn't wrong. They stood in silence, the air heavy with memory. Eleanor could feel them all, Thomas, Leo, Margaret, the ghosts who had built this story, standing unseen but near. She reached for the key. "Would you like to do it together?" she asked. They nodded. Each of them placed a hand on the clock Iris's wrinkled fingers, Luka's calloused ones, the small, soft hand of the little girl, and Eleanor's trembling own. Together, they turned the key one last time. The gears clicked. The pendulum swayed. And then, as if clearing its throat after a long sleep, the clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3, 4 notes clear and warm, resonating through the shop like sunlight breaking through glass. The sound rolled over them, filling every corner, every space between heartbeats. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. When the final chime faded, Iris let out a breath. Luka's daughter clapped softly, the sound small but joyful. Eleanor smiled through tears. "It's finished," she whispered. "It's finally finished." After a while, they drank tea at the counter, the cups clinking softly in rhythm with the ticking all around them. Iris shared memories of Ashcombe, of the children who'd come and gone, of the day Leo disappeared, of how the air had seemed to change after. Luka told stories of Jonas, of the toys he'd carved, the music boxes he'd built, the way he'd hum while he worked. Eleanor listened, the stories weaving together like threads from 2 torn halves of the same fabric. When the others left, promising to return in spring, she stayed behind. The shop was quiet again, but not empty. She sat at the workbench, pen in hand, and wrote her own letter. "Dear Leo, I wish I could have met you. I wish you could have seen how much you were loved. The clock is finished. It's yours now. We remember you. Always. Love, Eleanor." She folded the note and placed it inside the clock's hidden compartment, alongside her grandfather's letters and Leo's drawing of the clock tower. Then she sealed it and ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the heartbeat of it beneath her touch. The shop felt different now, lighter, fuller, as if time had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. The ticking wrapped around her like warmth, a lullaby made of memory. She sat back, eyes closed, listening. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, settling gently against the shop window. Each flake melted and slid down the glass, tracing silver trails in the light. Inside, the clock chimed again soft. Sure, forgiving. And for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor didn't feel like she was running out of time. She felt as if she'd finally caught up with it. Chapter 7. The Keeper of Time. Winter came quietly to York, as it often did without fanfare, without snow at first, just a slow folding of light into shorter days and the faint tang of smoke rising from the chimneys along the shambles. The city seemed to breathe differently then, softer, slower, as if it too needed rest. Inside Hartley timepieces, the air was warm and golden. Dozens of clocks ticked in unison now, not perfectly, but close enough that their rhythm filled the shop like the murmur of conversation in a familiar room. Eleanor had grown used to it, the soft, clicking heartbeat that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. It had become a kind of company, a chorus of voices she'd once thought lost. 3 months had passed since the day the clock had chimed. The story of the clock that waited, as people had begun to call it, had spread quietly, first through York, then further afield. The local paper had printed a small piece about her grandfather and the letters he'd written to the boy who never came home. Visitors began to come, not many at first, but enough to fill the narrow shop with the hum of footsteps and low voices. They came not to buy, but to remember. One woman had brought her father's pocket watch, asking if Eleanor might wind it just once. "He used to wear it every day," she'd said. "And I can't bear the silence anymore." A young man had come in clutching an old cuckoo clock that hadn't ticked since his grandmother died, and when Eleanor got it working again, he'd stood there with tears in his eyes, whispering, "That sound, it's like she's still here." It was no longer just a shop. It had become something else, a place for keeping time in more ways than one. Eleanor had turned one wall into a small exhibition. Her grandfather's tools, carefully cleaned and mounted, his handwriting preserved on tiny plaques beside them. Another held photographs Leo's drawing of the church tower, Jonas's carvings, the faded snapshot Luca had given her of him smiling beside a violin. At the center stood the clock, her grandfather's unfinished masterpiece, now completed, its face polished to a soft gleam. It chimed every hour with that same gentle warmth, filling the air with something that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite silence, something in between. People often asked her how she kept all the clocks running. She'd just smile and say, "I don't keep them running, they keep me." There was a guest book near the counter now. At first, it had been for visitors to sign their names, but people began leaving messages instead. Some were short. For Mum, who always said, "Time heals." Others were pages-long confessions, love letters, fragments of memory written in trembling hands. Some left photographs, pressed flowers, folded notes, sealed with wax. Eleanor read them all. Each one felt like a continuation of the letters her grandfather had written. The words changed, but the intent was always the same: to remember, to reach across time. One evening, as dusk pressed its cold palms against the window, a little boy came in with his mother. He couldn't have been more than 7. He stood on tiptoe, peering into the glass case that held the smaller clocks. His eyes widened as a cuckoo burst out of its door, chirping merrily. He laughed a sound so bright and sudden that it startled her. "That one's my favorite," he said, turning to her. "It sounds happy." Eleanor smiled. "It is happy," she said softly. "It's been waiting to sing for a long time." He nodded solemnly. as if he understood, then took his mother's hand. Before they left, he pressed a paper feather drawn in bright crayon onto the counter. "For your clock?" he said, "so it doesn't get lonely." After they'd gone, Eleanor slipped the feather into the display case beside her grandfather's tools. For a moment, she felt an ache rise in her throat, that tender, aching kind of joy that came from realizing life was still moving forward. The city beyond the window had begun to sparkle with early Christmas lights. Somewhere down the street, a carol drifted through the chill air, faint, off-key, but comforting. Eleanor made tea, wrapped her hands around the cup, and looked at the photograph of her grandfather on the wall. He was young in it, younger than she was, now standing proudly outside the shop, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright. "Granddad," she murmured, her breath fogging the glass, "I think I finally understand." He hadn't been a cold man. Not really. He'd just been broken by silence. He'd tried to fix time the way other people tried to fix their hearts, piece by piece, cog by cog, until it could carry the weight of what he couldn't say. She set the cup down and opened the hidden compartment in the base of the great clock. The letters still rested there, carefully folded, the paper worn soft from handling. She added a new one, her last. "Dear Granddad, I understand now. You weren't silent, you were waiting. You were keeping the world running while the rest of us caught up. The clock is finished. The shop is open. We're all home again. Love always, Eleanor." She sealed it and tucked it among the others. The clock ticked, steady and strong, its pendulum swinging like a slow heartbeat. Outside, snow began to fall. The flakes caught in the glow of the street lamps, drifting down like pieces of quiet time. Passers-by paused to watch, collars turned up, faces softened. Eleanor stepped outside for a moment, standing beneath the shop sign. The words Hartley timepieces gleamed faintly beneath a dusting of snow. She tilted her face upward and let a few flakes settle on her lashes, melting warm against her skin. Through the window, the clocks glimmered in their synchronized glow, little worlds of memory, all ticking toward something better. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel like an heir to silence. She felt like a keeper of time. She turned the shop's open sign to closed, though the door would never truly be shut again, not to memory, not to love, not to time. Then she locked the door gently and stood there a while longer, listening to the sound that filled the cold evening air. The steady, faithful ticking of a clock that had waited and, at last, been heard. If this story found a place in your heart, please take a moment before you go. Tap the bell, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Every listen, every share, helps keep these stories alive, for those who need to remember and for those who need to feel. You've been listening to The Clockmaker's Silence, written by Coops, from the playlist So You Wanna Cry. Because some stories don't just end, they keep ticking, long after the final word fades.